Hi there, everyone. It is 1 o'clock. Welcome to the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. We're happy to have you with us on this live and interactive show. We welcome your comments and your questions throughout this show. We've got a big one today. As you can see, my co-host Edgar Zazwata, ACSA's Senior Director of Policy and Governmental Relations, with us. I'm Naj Alikan, ACSA's Senior Director of Marketing and Communications. Edgar, we've got so much going on. I always think it's interesting that people outside of education, when they think that the school year is done, they just think, oh, school districts are like on a 3-month break and there's nothing going on. But clearly, that is not the case, especially right now during this pandemic.
Especially this year. I mean, I think if there was ever a time where there's not going to be a slow moment for our educators, for all the folks in the field, it's this year, given the circumstances are so different. There's always a lot of planning, but I think that's even escalated this year, just given all of the different variables. So yeah, it's a busy time, not just in Sacramento, but for our folks doing the work down on the ground.
Yeah, and there's been so much information about the budget. Last week, we were talking with Kevin Gordon, and we expected we'd have something within 36 to 48 hours. We're starting to hear more come in about it. Give us an update on what you're hearing.
Yeah, the highlights here are, so good news. It's always good to start on the good news, is that especially when we were having this conversation just weeks ago after the May revise, we were talking about pretty drastic cuts, and there was no other way how to sugarcoat it. We were talking about drastic cuts to education that were really going to impact the basic ability of our folks to meet the needs of our students, to open up schools. Luckily, and I think this is attributed largely to just our folks voicing their opinions and really doing some educating to the members, is that they pushed on the policymakers. And as a result, a number of those reductions have been taken off the table. We're not going to see cuts to education. Now, I give the caveat, are folks going to get all the resources that they need to do this work? No, the reality is that we were hurting financially even before COVID-19. So I don't want to make I don't want to give the impression that, hey, we're good, like that we're getting every resource we need. No, the reality is that some of the challenges that we're going to face here in the fall in terms of opening up schools are going to exceed the resources that we get. But with that said, they did take a number of those reductions off the table. So there's a lot of victory there. What happens in this time of year, and we're going to go into detail here later today, and then we'll talk about this, is there's a lot of ed trailer bills. So it's basically the language that is going to implement what the budget actually says. So there's issues around when can we do distance learning, some parameters on layoffs, you name it. I know some of the flexibilities that our members have been asking about waivers and instructional minutes. Those are the type of things that luckily the legislature has listened to us in terms of those flexibilities and given us the authority to think outside the box because of the different models that our folks are going to have to utilize in this upcoming year.
And we do want to remind all of our viewers right now, we've got several live viewers, and we invite you to say hello and send in your questions for Edgar and our guest who's coming up in a couple of minutes, Ron Nochetti, who is the executive director of the CIF. He'll be here in a couple of minutes to talk about high school sports, the role CIF plays, and what life has been like for student athletes and athletic programs during this COVID-19 pandemic. So that's coming up in just a couple of moments. Again, send in your questions and your comments. Edgar, your department is going to be giving a briefing later on today about the budget, about the public education piece specifically. Can you just preview a little bit of that and what you guys are going to be talking about?
Yeah, we'll do a deep dive. Obviously, I'm talking a little bit of the highlights here, but there's a lot here. There's 342 pages worth of education statute and implementing language. So the idea for today's webinar that we'll put on this afternoon is that we will talk about the budget, obviously the numbers, how much money we're going to get in terms of schools. But I have to imagine that where people are going to have a lot of questions is all of the other things, all the other components that also make up the state budget as it pertains to education. Namely, under what circumstances can I do distance learning? What are the restrictions that I'm going to have? So those and a myriad of other issues we will be discussing at 4 o'clock this afternoon with our members. So we encourage folks to jump on there and to be prepared with questions.
All right, folks, and thank you for that, and thank you for our viewers who are with us today, our live viewers. We just saw a comment, a hello come in from our former president, Holly Eads. Holly, good to see you today. One thing that we have heard so much about, so many questions, so much confusion, is about high school athletics, especially during this COVID-19 pandemic. And last week, when we talked budget, we said we bring on experts, not a bunch of nobodies onto this show. So what we did today was bring in the executive director of the California Interscholastic Federation, that is Ron Nocetti. Ron, pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, Ron, let me ask you for a little clarity, because when it comes to reopening schools, we know that the reopening is largely localized. It's school districts, it's county departments of health building some type of a guidance. Can you talk a little bit about the role, the overall role of the CIF and how your state governing body works with school districts?
Sure, absolutely. The CIF is the governing body of state high school athletics in California. We're allowed to operate by the state legislature, and we're under the purview of the California Department of Education. And we basically set the rules and regulations for high school sports in the state of California. We offer championship events. We set the sport calendars for regional and state championships. And then we have 10 localized CIF sections, given the size of our state. And those sections do much of the same on a more local level with their schools and school districts.
And Edgar, if I remember, you had a question specifically about feedback.
Yeah, so one of the things that, obviously, and I think one thing that Naj and I mentioned that we have to put in our own, kind of where we come to this conversation. I know we're both youth coaches, grew up playing sports, kids in the public system. So there's always that perspective of us, like everybody else, can't wait to see, these athletics come back, because it is such an important part of our school experience. But there is the question in terms of just what the thinking is in terms of keeping our students safe. And I'm sure that there's this delicate balance that you folks are facing, whether it be at the state or where you're thinking about this locally. So kind of what do you say to folks there when you get posed this question in terms of feedback and how communities will deal with this, and how do we balance the needs of obviously getting athletics back with this delicate balance on what may be happening in the local community?
Sure. Well, I mean, first and foremost, as you said, at the health and safety of our student athletes and everyone involved with high school athletics, our coaches, our officials, our spectators, the teachers on our campuses, that's at the forefront of everyone's concern right now. We all recognize that high school sports and all co-curriculars for that matter, drama, music, the arts, they're incredibly important to the students' physical, social, and mental well-being. And I think that's where everyone's coming from the point of view that, we need to do everything we can to return to play, to return to co-curricular activities, sports as we know it. But I think we also have to make sure that we keep reminding people that it has to be done in the healthiest and safest manner possible. And I think that's where we take our guidance. It's who we take our guidance from. And, we have to take our guidance, and they're taking our guidance from the governor's office, the California Department of Education, and then the California State Health Department, Public Health Department, and then the school districts also have to take into consideration, and probably most importantly, their local public health departments and how they're advising their school districts and the other schools in their counties.
Ron, I want to take you back to March because, we're right in that spot about the boys and girls high school basketball playoffs. We're starting to have more things happen with the pandemic. Tell me about how CIF was having to operate during those early stages of the pandemic, because there was so much going on at that time with high school athletics. What was that experience like?
Sure. It was, it started out like I think everything regarding this very slowly. And we got a call from a school in the first week of our tournament that they had just played their first contest, and not a student athlete, but possibly someone on their campus had been exposed, and they were awaiting tests. And remember, those were times where it took up to 3 days to get a test result. And so there was a lot of waiting going on. And then as the tournament went along, we all started to see the red flags come up, because we had more and more schools that were having to pull out of the event just out of an abundance of caution. And then we finally, we were working closely with health departments at that time from the very beginning, because we're not going to make medical decisions regarding the health and safety of anyone at our events. And it finally got to the point, the day before our state basketball championships were to take place at the Golden One Center in Sacramento, that we were basically told that this isn't going to happen. And that was one of the hardest phone conversations we've ever had to have with our school people, is to let them know that, you're all planning on getting on a bus, getting on a plane to come to Sacramento this weekend. And unfortunately, the event is called off.
Ron, you touched on this a couple times, and maybe just expand on it. And I'm sure you're getting, on all these different forums, I've seen you, talk on different web streams or be interviewed. And it's real quick that people are frustrated, right? And people feel very passionately about youth sports and high school sports in particular. In some communities, it really is the unifier in particular communities. And there's a lot, I've seen some of that frustration, whether it be directed at you or directed at school districts or at the state. Kind of one of the pieces on where does the buck stop? Who is making the call on some of these decisions? I know we've gotten some questions from some of our members of why is it that in County X, they're now being allowed to start up and open up practice, where my county or my school district is saying no. So maybe you could talk to us about just kind of the decision-making process, not to direct the frustration at others, but just like how these decisions are being made, even now, even before we get to competition, just initially of folks or teams being allowed to do socially distanced practices or non-contact drills, and who's making that call?
Sure. So in order to be a resource for our member schools, we recently introduced guidance of how to return to physical activity and training. We purposely didn't talk about contests, because that's in the fall. I think what our schools were looking for is, once they were allowed to do so by their school district in cooperation with their local counties, based on information from the state, how do we return our students to campus? And so we released guidance to do that in phases, and also, more about conditioning and making sure that when it did happen, that it happened very slowly. Even though these are young people and they're obviously very resilient physically, they haven't been involved in a lot of physical activity for the most part since March. And so we have to be cautious about how we return them to that activity. As far as where the decisions are made, the California State Department of Public Health has released overriding guidelines for the state. And then within those guidelines, local county health departments are able to make some decisions based on what they're seeing in their local area with respect to COVID-19. So in some areas, you may see that they're only allowed to return and do physical conditioning, with social distancing. And they can't even have any shared equipment, not a ball, nothing. In other counties, you'll see that there's been some allowance of shared equipment while in a small group, as long as that volleyball, for example, is not shared outside that pod of kids without being cleaned. That's all coming from the local county health departments. And our school districts are doing everything they can right now to return. They understand the importance of this, but they're going to do it in a healthy and safe manner and listen to the guidance from their local county health officials.
Ron, we're starting to get some questions in, and we welcome your questions. Go ahead and keep sending them in. But Michael Burchett offers a really good question. Being that the amount of contact and student proximity in fall sports is in more so than in the spring sports, has there been any discussion about flip-flopping the seasons at any point?
Sure. There's been conversation about that. And I think the chief concern on that at this time is that no one knows what this fall is going to look like. I don't think anyone can tell you what is going to happen with COVID-19 in the fall. And the one thing that we want to make sure is that if we were to bring spring sports to the fall and then something were to happen and they would have to be postponed several weeks or even halfway through the season, those student athletes just lost a season. And so we're going to be very reluctant to switch an entire season like that. I mean, we've said over and over again that everything's on the table, but I think we have to be very careful when we're looking about switching. And then, that would also mean if we're going to flip, then does football go to the spring? Well, if you play football in the spring and start in March and don't end till early to mid-June, then do we expect these student athletes with concerns related to concussions and overuse to then pick up and start playing football again 4 weeks later for the fall season? So I think that all has to be taken into consideration when we're making those decisions.
Ron, we know everybody's thinking about these issues, and a lot of our athletes, in addition to being, participating in high school sports, they're in a number of club sports, or some of them even at a national level. And we got a question from our member Holly, who's talking about swimming, and we know her. She has a daughter who's a prolific swimmer there, so I know where the question's coming from. But they're also setting up protocols. I know the same holds true for U.S. soccer, where they're putting forth return to play protocols. So how are those guidelines also being included in terms of what state, county, or you folks as CIF are taking into account when developing these guidelines?
Sure. We're taking from a number of different sources. The National Federation of High School Associations, NFHS, released overriding guidelines for the states, and we use those. And those guidelines were done in conjunction with a lot of the governing bodies, such as USA Swimming, and how it can be done appropriately. I believe USA Swimming started with recommendations of only one person to a lane, and I know those are fluid like everything else and are currently changing. But yes, we're absolutely taking those into consideration. The biggest issue that we have to consider is that, we're introducing guidelines that have to be done for the entire state. And then our local school districts and our local counties have to take those and make them their own with respect to what they're seeing in their local areas. And, you mentioned club sports, and obviously club sports play a role in athletics in our state and in the country. And, our concern right now is that, our school people are going to follow rules and regulations. And I think for the most part, you're going to see club officials do the same, but we're seeing events already taking place. We're seeing games taking place, tournaments indoors taking place. And there's been no guidance that I'm aware of that's been released by the California Department of Public Health or any local county that says that youth sports are allowed to start as far as contests and games at this time. So that's a concern, because our schools are worried that they're going to have them on their campus. They're going to have them be socially distant while they're conditioning. And then they go off and get into a crowded gymnasium at a basketball tournament for a weekend. And what are we then preventing? So we all have to be in this together, and our state knows that, and they're doing everything they can. But given a state our size, it's up to our communities to hold each other accountable as well.
Yeah, I get that. I get phone calls almost on a daily basis about, and just in my capacity dealing with youth sports, and as a coach or an administrator, there's a lot of we saw so-and-so club, having a game. We saw so-and-so having a practice. What does this mean? But I think to your point, and one of the things we were going to say at the forefront, we've been working with the governor's office as well, because we get this question. And I think with the message that we received is that the California Department of Public Health is working on guidelines, but those guidelines aren't out. Those guidelines are not in existence today, but that we do foresee that coming forth sometime here in the future.
Absolutely. And then that's why we tried to extend our date and our guidance to July 20th, knowing that that's very close to our start of fall sports practice. But we wanted to play out that date as long as we could, because we're trying to give every opportunity for there to be a fall season that starts on time or with a delay if possible. And, we hope by July 20th, we're going to have a lot more information, such as the guidelines you mentioned.
Hey, Ron, we just got a question in from one of our members, Muhammad Rod, who's over at Franklin High School in Elk Grove Unified. And he asked a really interesting question. And at some point, he's going to have to clarify why Marcus Mariota is the avatar on his Facebook account. But the question he has is essentially everybody has had to pivot in some manner in school administration and really in education in general based on this pandemic. And I wonder if you could maybe give us some feedback on any changing role with the athletic director now, with so many different things to have to balance, not just the participation, not just, the health guidelines there, but just in moving through some of the issues that you've spoken about.
Well, absolutely. And first of all, I know that their title is athletic director. I like to refer to them as athletic administrators, because they administer outside of academics, they administer the largest co-curricular program on their campus. And many of them do so with very minimal, if any, release time. The ones that have more than 2 or 3 periods release time in our state are incredibly fortunate. And no matter what direction we go, there's going to be additional work, whether it's screening of student athletes when they come on the campus, whether during the summer, or how they start to practice, or how contests are run and how they're going to handle spectators. And we're going to do everything we can to be a resource. But our athletic administrators, these are the best people around. They're going to do what they can, and they're going to go the extra mile to make things work for their students. While I don't know them all by name, because there's over 1,600 member schools, Mohammed's very lucky to have Mike Cody on the campus at Franklin High School. Him and his entire staff do a fabulous job there, and they're going to make it work for the student athletes.
Ron, there doesn't go a day that we don't somehow talk about face coverings and masks, right? The California Department of Public Health put out some guidance that applied to all Californians last week. We've been talking about that as the school guidelines came out. This is a question that's coming up a lot in terms of athletics. And Ryan, who comes from my neck of the woods in Paloma Valley, I'm from Paris, asked about the guidelines from CIF about wearing masks during practices, and some of the concerns about whether that's feasible, whether it be in the heat or if people are exerting themselves. So can you speak to this whole issue of face coverings?
No, it's a great question that Ryan's asking. And, like so many of our rules and regulations, let's go back a year before we had any experience with COVID-19. Some schools are going to have to do some things a little differently based on their geographics. Given the size of California, we're going to have some that are practicing from day one in weather over 100 degrees, and others that never get above 70 degrees. So I think with masks, it's going to be incumbent upon the schools to do it in a safe manner and in accordance with local county guidelines. Obviously, we're releasing guidance that is statewide, knowing that some are not going to be able to function and wear those in a safe manner. All we would recommend to our schools is that whatever they're going to do, they do so in conjunction with their principal, their school district, and their local counties.
Ron, the trickle-down impact of guidance, Edgar referred to it earlier. Both he and I have daughters, and he has a son that are in youth sports. And there are so many things that are happening right now as far as some sports are getting back onto the field, youth sports-wise. Others, there's still that pause. How much of an impact do you see some of these regulations from the CIF as far as their guidance, CDPH, CDE, how far do you think some of the guidance will trickle down into the youth sports?
Well, I think youth sports, a lot of times, there are some youth sports organizations that, especially in the educational realm, that use CIF rules, even though they're not required to do so. Obviously, we're charged with governing 9 through 12 athletics, but we make available all of our resources, and we share them if they want to use our resources, because we're very fortunate. For example, our medical guidelines are being developed in conjunction with our sports medicine advisory committee, and we have MDs from various roles on that committee, athletic trainers on that committee, school administrators. We have a neuropsychologist on that committee. So we're incredibly lucky to have groups of people like that volunteer their time to help us with that. And so all of our resources are available. And I do hope that a lot of it trickles down, because I think education is going to look at this from a very different lens, and how they return to campus, how they do so safely. And we're happy to share those resources with anyone.
Ron, we got another question from Jamie here, and it's an issue that comes up a lot in terms of the mental health. As a parent, I'm the first to say, obviously, you see, there's no way that kids being pulled out of school, being in this social distancing environment for months, that didn't have some impact. And one of the things that we hear a lot is when we're thinking about the physical safety of students, is that being weighed? Is the appropriate amount of weight and guidance being thought about when thinking about the mental health of our students in terms of making these decisions of when we're going to open up? And you spoke a little bit about this, but to what extent does CIF, or would you say the state, is thinking about this piece?
Well, absolutely. It's certainly, and that's why in our foundational statement, we mentioned that in the first sentence, the importance of that. And I think it's extremely important. I think it was important before COVID-19. I think we've seen some very prominent people such as Kevin Love come forward and talk about struggles that they've had. And it's been great because it's open conversations, and hopefully our student athletes know, as any of our students, that this is something, not only is it okay to talk about it, but you got to talk about it. You got to reach out to the appropriate people at your school communities. We're very fortunate in education-based athletics that schools are going to make this issue part of the forefront. And, there may be a possibility, obviously, that as we get closer, that some sports or all sports have to be delayed. It doesn't mean that there still can't be ways to engage these students on their campuses with their coaches, with their teammates where appropriate. And that's one of the first things that we saw our coaches statewide do back in March, is immediately started with these Zoom meetings. I know they don't replace physical being in front of your teammates, but it does give these students an avenue to talk and to have that connection. And when it really comes down to it, isn't that what sports does? It makes connections, connects students, it connects them with their coaches. And I think that's also why it's so important that when we look at this, obviously, we're looking at this from the student lens, but we also have to know that we're part of a greater community and we're all responsible to work together until we get through this.
Ron, there's and I'm not going to pronounce the name because, like Naj, which is mispronounced many times, I'm not even going to attempt to mention the name other than say, Mr. Takahashi, your question, and I'm going to try and summarize it. Will 10 students, 12 students, 6 feet distance, all of that. When you have something like that, and then we're talking about a contact sport, like with 50 football players that are slamming into each other, there are a lot of questions that come with that. Do you go back and say, look, this is we're providing guidance, but ultimately it has to be more of a local decision? Or are you really trying to say, hey, guys, you got to think about X, Y, and Z, and you got to be really, really substantive about that discussion?
Well, I think first and foremost, our schools are already looking at the substantive part of that discussion. And so, yes, ultimately, there are going to be some local decisions made here. We will certainly release what we see is happening and what we think can happen in the fall and moving forward. And if there was a shift in any of the sports seasons, but there also might be certain areas of the state that say, we should have very little cases and we can go forward now. And we would just encourage them to communicate with their local section offices in making those decisions. But I think most of our state, they want to stay together because they also know that the community built through high school athletics goes beyond their local communities. With social distancing, is it correct that there are going to be some sports that might be harder to start on time than others? Absolutely. But again, it goes back to why we're waiting until July 20th to make decisions, because as we've seen, we've been dealing with this now since, March 15th in California, roughly. That's still almost 30 days more. It's a great percentage of the time period we've already been dealing with it. So we still do have some time on our side. We also have to know how schools are going to return. And I know that school districts, that's going to be a huge issue for them is, are they going to return with everyone on campus in a hybrid model, online only? So there's a lot of information we have to gather from our schools before we know where we can go with sports moving forward.
Ron, as we talked about this, and I think just by the amount of people who have tuned in and given us comments, and you've been very generous with your time. I know we're going to get a couple more questions here or start wrapping it up, but just your thoughts on advice for families and for parents at this point. I've seen on social media, I saw people organizing demonstrations in front of local county health, or like we said, or directing some of the frustration to school districts or maybe even CIF. And sometimes I think it's people not really even understanding of how they could impact some of these decisions and really feeling like they want to do something. And I think they're just trying to represent their kids, obviously, and then trying to push for what's best for them. So just advice that you would give our families, that everybody's in this period of uncertainty about how they can manage this, where they can go to get that information, anything that they can do.
Sure. Well, I mean, first and foremost, I'd say I'm a father of 4, and they've all played high school sports. And I have a senior to be who's a water polo player. And, the biggest conversation we have is, one, just to continue to have the conversation, I think is most important, to let them vent their frustrations. And I think parents have to be given the ability to vent their frustrations too. I think everyone needs to be open to hearing from our local constituencies on what they think and answering their questions and being as honest as transparent, and telling them why we're making the decisions and what we're using to make the decisions. Some may agree and some may disagree, and that's the reality, but we need to at least share how we're making the decisions. What we share with our kids is, sports are going to return. Right now there's just so much unknown to this, and so much unknown about how it impacts every age group. And what we talk to our kids about is they're not just responsible for going to school, and maybe they won't be impacted, but when they come home, okay, well, that's our family decision, right? That if we're worried about being impacted, that's our decision on whether we're going to let them go or not. But we're also going to, at some point in time, go out into the community. And so our decisions impact greater numbers than just our immediate family. And so we're having those conversations with our kids, and I know families all over California are having the same conversations.
Hey, Ron, I should have prepared you for this final question, and I didn't do it.
That's all right.
And so you're going to have to come up with an answer right off the top of your head. We have so many common nicknames, mascots across all sports. And I'm wondering what comes to mind as one of the most unique mascots that you have heard. And I ask that because, I grew up in Roseville, and I'm an Oakmont Viking. The one that is the most creative is over at San Benito High School, the hay baler. And I'm wondering if you have one that just kind of sticks out as, this is one of the most creative mascots I've heard.
Well, it's not the most creative, but you gotta allow me to give a shout out to my school that I graduated from, Sacred Heart High School in San Francisco, and it was the Fighting Irish. There's not a lot that have that mascot, so I guess we can say it's unique in the state of California. But there are definitely some unique ones out there, and I think it's fun. Part of the fun of high school sports is the uniqueness of it, the symbolism behind it, and what it means to our communities.
Ron Nochetti is the executive director of the CIF. Ron, we are so honored to have had you today. Thank you very much for the discussion. I know it's been so valuable for our viewers. Best of luck to you over these next few weeks and months as we roll sports back in to our communities. Thanks so much.
I appreciate you having me and giving me the opportunity to talk.
And folks, we want to remind you that this is a weekly show, the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. This is a weekly show. We're on here every Wednesday at 1 o'clock as we cover the most important issues in public education and bring on the guests that you need to hear from, which is why we talked about athletics today, because so many of the school districts are now beginning that fall conditioning program. So that's certainly a good thing to be able to hear that the CIF has some of that guidance out there, and that really there's a lot of discussion, Edgar, about what is taking place, and it's good information.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think this is all of us as parents, or our folks, even or the folks we represent, our administrators. I mean, they're fighting. We see them fighting for their students and trying to bring these programs because they know that they're at the center of why kids get motivated to come to school, whether it be athletics, the arts, or other co-curricular activities. We can see that this is a big issue, and we're going to continue to keep our eye on it.
Well, we're past the bottom of the hour. When you have good discussion, you certainly keep it going until you run out of steam. Edgar, good seeing you.
Hey, Naj, I know you've been a busy man, but I did want to. I know you had a special day yesterday. Happy birthday to you! So
thank you.
Appreciate you putting in on this work and connecting with our members. But I hope it was a good one.
You know what? I only worked half the day yesterday, so it was a typical ACSA day. The work doesn't stop, that's for sure. Edgar, today, 4 o'clock, budget breakdown webinar that's coming up. You and your team, looking forward to that.
Yeah, we'll address a lot of the questions that we saw on distance learning or whatnot. Tune in at 4, and we'll have a lengthy conversation.
Sounds good, man. Good seeing you.
Fun as always. Thanks, Naj.
Thank you, folks, very much for joining us today on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. Again, we're here next Wednesday with a live and interactive show. Thanks so much.